Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Welcome. My name is Anthony Chuli, Director of Product Marketing here at 250 OK. And today I'm joined by two of my great colleagues, Brandon Dingy, Vice President of Partnerships, and Matthew Vernhout, Director of Privacy at 250 OK. Thanks, guys, for joining. How are you?
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Doing good.
Good.
Thanks for having us.
Today we're going to be talking about DMARC, our favorite subject. My goal today for this conversation is really to start off high level and understand what DMARC is, its history, its existence, but also what it means for marketers and why they should care about DMARC. So to kick things off, DMARC is an acronym, right? I'd love to understand, Brandon, not only what DMARC stands for our audience first and foremost, but then if you can kind of dive into the history of DMARC, where it is today, how the adoption has taken place, present date, and then we can start moving through perhaps what it does, why it matters, and the different ways to customize a DMARC record.
Yeah, definitely. So the DMARC standard itself is developed in an effort to basically give owners of their domains the power to control who sends on behalf of their domains. And they do that by leveraging two existing standards of SPF and DKIM that are out there that historically had the intention to prevent misuse of domains, but the adoption of it was not as widespread as ISPs and receivers would like. So the idea was to put a standard in place where the actual domain owner can say, yeah, I know where all my mail is coming from. I know that it authenticates properly. And I want to assert a policy that says, if you see mail that doesn't look like me, don't accept it. And that's more or less how it came to be. It's still relatively young in its, if you look at just over the course of time, in age, but adoption has definitely ramped up in the recent years due to the ongoing abuse that we see of phishing, business email compromise. It's front and center that email continues to be the top vector to attack end users.
And so how does it build off of the standard SPF and DKIM authentication that we're more familiar with? What's the difference between DMARC and how that builds off of those standard protocols and how SPF and DKIM operate?
So they're leveraging those two standards that are basically ways to validate a message came from where it was supposed to come from, essentially. SPF is leveraging IP address and domain to validate if that transaction is valid, more or less, and then DKIM is leveraging the body of the message and validating if basically the encryption and the key match, right?
The content's the same. Yeah.
So two different ways of authenticating email that happened, and then DMARC pulls it together of looking at both of those email standards and seeing if they validate.
And it's a free protocol, right? It doesn't cost any money to create. It's just a DNS text record. Matthew, some of the things to consider if some of our audience members are tuning in and saying something that we've always considered, it's on our roadmap. What would you recommend as far as kind of the steps to consider and weigh in on if DMARC is something that a brand wants to incorporate?
Sure. I think right off the bat, a none policy gets you started. It has no impact to your current programs, no impact to current deliverability, but it starts the flow of data. You start to get your aggregate reports in. Within 24 hours of setting up the record, you're starting to get inbound data responses from receiving networks that share that information. And if that's something you're planning, 6 months from now, I'm going to start my DMARC. Well, do that now. So 6 months from now, you have a 6-month look back on history to say, I need to start fixing my SPF records. I have to do a domain inventory. I have to understand, who are my approved vendors. Do I have legacy vendors that are still sending mail on my behalf? You have that history. It gives you sort of time. If you wait 6 months to do it, you're already 6 months sort of behind. Moving from a none policy to a quarantine policy, depending on number of domains, how good or bad things were previously set up, doesn't have to take forever. It could be a matter of weeks or a couple short months to get that taken care of. And then once that's sort of done, you can evaluate the impact, and if it's right for your company, if you have a lot of phishing or spoofing, moving to a reject policy. That's not for everybody. Sometimes quarantine's just enough, but where you see abuse and bad things happening to your domain and your brands, absolutely consider a DMARC policy.
So that visibility piece is unique, right? It's not only authentication protocol, but it's also you're getting data back from mailbox providers that you can take action on or perhaps be enlightened by, right? And I think the biggest piece for me is DMARC is one of those things where when you incorporate it, you start getting more insight and inventory about who's sending off of this domain, whether you're aware of it or perhaps not aware of it. And it may be a legacy vendor or an HR system that was sending off of your domain that no longer is a partner. And it allows you to kind of take that inventory step with that first initial policy of none, get your house in order, and then consider moving to a quarantine or reject policy.
Yeah, it also shows you potentially if other people, bad actors, spammers, spoofers, phishers are using your domain.
For
it gives you that
reasons, yep.
insight virtually overnight.
Yep. So I know that we have this DMARC wizard, a part of our tool set. How easy is it to create a DMARC record?
A none record, probably 2 minutes worth of work on the website, and your DNS guy, maybe 5-10 minutes of work. So the none policy is super simple. It really is a single text record that goes into your DNS on the domain with a few flags, which you determine as you set it through the wizard. Copy, paste. In you go. It doesn't get much more simple than that. It's the digestion of the data that comes back that's more complicated.
Right. And our tool allows those aggregate and forensic reports to come in and make heads and tails of it and organize it in a way that's easily digestible.
Yeah.
Brandon, talk about kind of the difference. You touched on this earlier about the different policy settings that are available with the DMARC record, but from a risk assessment standpoint, there's really no risk with creating a record if it's a P equals none, just to start getting that flow of data back. And then as you take inventory and kind of identify potential malicious or perhaps not malicious, but illegitimate mail streams coming off your domain, then it might be time to consider moving to a more stricter policy setting.
Yeah, definitely. I think you outlined it perfectly. Of once you publish the record, as Matt mentioned, you're going to receive a ton of information back or data back from the DMARC reports, and you're trying to make heads or tails of what's legitimate, what's not legitimate, and where are my problem areas that I got to tackle. And so it really kind of turns into a journey, but depending on how wide you're going to go with the domains that you own and how many you're going to protect. If you're focused on your marketing domains, you have a pretty narrow focus. But if you may be in charge of a broader set of domains across your company, you have to prioritize which ones you're going to tackle first, and then go down that process of reviewing the data, assessing how much risk there is to your mail stream of potentially blocking the legitimate mail that's out there.
So it's a powerful protocol, right? It's not one to be taken lightly and just throw on reject and forget about it. It certainly can do damage if not done correctly.
Yeah, it can definitely put some strain on your email communication channels, whether it's your corporate traffic, your email marketing traffic, whatever it may be. You could be very disruptive if you go to a reject policy and you haven't done all of your due diligence on your ability to pass SPF and pass DKIM consistently for those domains. It could definitely throw you for a curveball. The bright side, I guess, is that if you do have an issue or an error, you can back it out fairly quickly. As Matt noted, get with your DNS guy, you can switch the policy back to none, or quarantine if you feel like you are experiencing a lot of malicious activity on your domain. You may still want mail to get delivered, but it goes to the quarantine folder, and you're at a point where you can then figure out what's wrong with your email authentication causing those issues. So there's plenty of options, but once you go to the strict side of the policy, you're kind of setting yourself up for potential problems if you haven't done all your work.
Matthew, I'd love to get your point of view. I know that we worked with Furniture Row on setting up DMARC and have a webinar up on our site about that experience and the results. How does a DMARC record, implementing a DMARC record, potentially have a positive impact on improving or maximizing email performance?
So in the case of Furniture Row, when we did the exercise with them to go through P equals none, right on through to P equals reject, what I think the biggest benefit that they saw and where really the deliverability impacts happened were they found all those pockets of old vendors or unknown vendors that marketing didn't know about. So, maybe some employees that were sending emails sort of irregularly, and all those things were impacting reputation. So not just turning on a DMARC record, that doesn't always
Right.
fix it for you. It certainly helps some of it. But what happens is it's the journey to get to a P equals reject that really improves reputation, improves practices, improves, and that was one of the comments that was made during the webinar was, it improved even communication internally between corporate IT and management and marketing and their international divisions. And all those things together really sort of streamlined their process. And then when they went from a P equals quarantine to a P equals reject, they virtually saw overnight their reputation improve because they had taken all that effort to align everything, fix everything.
Right.
So it's that journey. It's the experience of...
Yeah. Simply turning on P equals reject doesn't improve your deliverability.
Right.
In fact, it can really break things.
And I think that a lot of times there's a misconception that DMARC improves deliverability. And I think there's some truth to that, but it's more about, as you mentioned, the journey and the experience and what you learn and perhaps alignment and changes that you make. It's not necessarily just flipping it on is all of a sudden going to maximize.
I would say that myth exists regardless of DMARC or SPF or DKIM. People a lot of times think, well, if I put an SPF record, my deliverability gets better. I put a DMARC record or DKIM record in, my deliverability gets better. It doesn't. It's that journey of making sure it's configured properly, making sure all your, products are set up correctly and configured. That's what improves deliverability.
Yep.
That's what improves, through the use of authentication to make those things better.
Right.
So I wanted to shift as we're talking about Furniture Row and bring up an example of an actual DMARC record for FurnitureRow.com. And Brandon, if you will, do you mind walking through this actual record that exists for our audience to understand from a technical perspective each piece of a DMARC record and what it means?
Yeah, sure. There's a couple key areas that we'll focus on here. The V equals part of the record is required. You just need to make sure that doesn't accidentally get cut off when you're cutting and pasting it into the record, because that will basically make the rest of the record kind of null. So make sure that one makes it when you hand off the record to whoever's going to publish it in DNS. But the P equals reject one that we're looking at here, that's the really important one. When you're starting off and just publishing your DMARC record and getting started to receive data, you want that to be P equals none. And as you go down the journey, and you've done all of your risk assessment and you're confident you're going to be good, you can move it to quarantine or reject. The RUA, that's another important tag. That stands for the aggregate reports that come back through DMARC. So you're going to want to designate the email address that you want to receive these DMARC reports. It could be your own internal address. It could be the 250OK reporting address where we can receive the reports and visualize them in our product. And then there's the RUF tag that we see there. That's for forensic reports. That's going to be actual message samples that come back from the ISPs for messages that failed authentication. Again, you'll want to include the addresses where you want those to be received. And then we're looking at the FO tag. That's going to signal to the ISPs what level of data that you, and the receivers, or what level of data that you want to receive regarding authentication failures. You can designate a 1 here, which gives you a pretty wide view into authentication failures. There's other designations in the spec, the DMARC spec, that will allow you to narrow down which authentication failures you want to focus in on. The % tag, that's going to refer to the % of mail that you want to be impacted by your DMARC policy. So if you're doing quarantine or reject, you can kind of scale it up, working from 0 to 100 on the level of enforcement that you want. And then the RF tag really is just signaling to the receivers and the ISPs what format of reporting that you want the reports to be sent back to you in.
Great, thank you for that. As we close out, Matthew, I wanted to end with you and just talking about what you see as the future of DMARC or just authentication. Is it spurring new technology or new ideas that are folding into email? and also just how 250 OK can help customers not only educate them about DMARC, but also create a record and perhaps the tool itself.
Sure, yeah. So over the last, 2 decades almost, we've seen sort of the evolution of authentication. SPF came in early, then we saw domain keys and Internet Identified Mail, which became DKIM after the two techs merged. Now we have DMARC, and that's sort of the hot thing right now. But what's coming is we're starting to see BIMI, which is a brand indicator, in the UI. So right now, Oath is beta testing this. So if you're using the Yahoo mobile app, you'll see certified sender, well, not certified senders, the authenticated messages for BIMI showing up with their logo in the UI. In the web clients, you'll see the logo in the actual message. So what it is it's just another additional indicator for consumers to be able to say, I can trust this message because it's not only passing all these types of authentication, but the email client that I'm using trusts the sender enough to actually show me their brand in that. And that's sort of the next step. And we have worked with a couple clients, Furniture Row being one of them, to get into that current beta and really sort of help test that information out.
And what I think is great about BIMI is it builds off DMARC, right? It requires a DMARC record, but it's difference for me is it's visual, right? It's got the appeal from a marketer or a marketing standpoint, from impressions and brand impressions and just a visual representation that I recognize this logo. I know that if this logo is here, then the benefit also is from a security and alignment perspective, which maybe your average marketer or your subscriber may not care about, but certainly from a mailbox provider, that's their benefit, right? That's their benefit of jumping on board with BIMI, saying, if there's a certificate published, this image certificate, we know that it's aligned, we know it's signing with DMARC, and so it's a win-win situation really for everyone involved.
Yeah, we've also seen ARC. ARC is an extension to DMARC as well, and that really is sort of it's trying to solve something that DMARC almost inadvertently broke. And that was the idea of either being on a mailing list or forwarding mail from one account to another. So it's basically adding in a trust chain. Right. I received it originally. I trusted it. I did all the authentication. I'm now passing it to Brandon. He can look at it and say, oh, well, Matt validated this already. So now I just have to validate that he was right. So, there are additional technologies. They're coming. ARC is not one we talk about so much because it takes place mostly on the receiving side.
Yeah.
Senders don't have to do anything to participate, but it's good to know that it's out there.
Right. Great. Well, thank you guys so much for your time. This has been a really interesting conversation. And for all of those tuning in, I really hope that this was valuable in understanding what DMARC is, how it's important, the different policy settings, and what you should consider if DMARC is something that's on your roadmap. So thanks for everyone tuning in, and enjoy your rest of your day.